Once upon a time, stories of fantasy. People suffering with OCD aren't living a fantasy. Even though there are a lot of myths that go around obsessive compulsive disorder, their stories are real. These are stories from the OCD side. Real people, real stories, brought to you by FamilyOCD.com and invisiblewheelchair.com. We want your story. Go to invisiblewheelchair.com and contact us to tell us your story here. OCD is real. OCD treatments are real. OCD recovery is real. And so are these stories. So Jason, thank you so much for being part of the Invisible Wheelchair story from the OCD side. I'm looking forward to talking to another dad. So welcome.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to talk to you as well.
Well, Jason, this is here to tell your story about your journey through OCD, as I say. So if you would, let's go ahead and get right into your story.
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Jason Adams, and this is my story. So in July of 2019, my wife and I were blessed and fortunate to have two healthy fraternal twin boys. Very fortunate that babies and mom made it through very healthy. We had our few nights in the hospital and we came home. And right around that time was when, I always kind of refer to it as that's when multiple journeys in my life began. We brought them home. And of course, I call it kind of the ever evolving mix of routine and constant improvisation that every parent knows, right? You have your flexible routines, we call them, that began. But for me, something else began. I was really noticing day in and day out that I was struggling with intrusive thoughts to the extent that, I was noticing physical sensations along with them, mostly related to my boys. So a lot of thoughts around fear of harm coming to them, fear of exaggerated responsibility in terms of caring for them. Some things that I think most parents would probably be able to relate to. So for example, diaper changes. I wasn't so much worried about kind of my own contamination in my hands, but again, as every new parent knows, babies flap their arms and legs around when you're doing a diaper change, and sometimes things end up in places where they didn't originally come from. And again, most parents would say, I take a wipe, I clean it up, and it's no big deal. But for me, it would be a day or two of, oh my God, life-threatening illness. Oh my gosh, life-threatening illness, contamination, hepatitis, and anything I could think of. And it would typically take until at least the next day when they woke up without a fever or a rash or anything before I felt like things were okay again. I started having visualizations of kind of far off disaster scenarios. I'm going to speak very directly, but I hope this doesn't upset anybody. I just want to be clear about what I was feeling, So I would have thoughts of my boys drowning, falling off balconies, falling off cliffs, walking out into the street. And this is all when they're a month old and we hadn't taken them. they couldn't walk, let alone go to any of these places. That got worse and worse. And certainly, with twins, we were on full-time duty. We had a lot of family help, but we were also we were exhausted. And so between, the sleep deprivation that a lot of parents would know and these escalating symptoms, things just got worse and worse. And for me, certainly there was the physical exhaustion, but there was also this dissonance, this conflict of, this is supposed to be one of the most joyous, happy, exciting journeys I'll ever take in my life. Why am I stressed, exhausted, terrified? As I mentioned, there's those typical trigger points such as diaper changes and things like that. But I also had other ones that, my family were really kind of scratching their head over. When our boys were really young, we just had them in little, like the wraparound button-up onesie kinds of things. But once they started wearing shirts, I had a terrible time with it because every time I put a head hole on a shirt near their heads, I would get an intrusive thought of their neck turning and snapping. And it just, we laugh about it now because my response to that at the time, not wanting to really tell anybody what was going on, was I would just stretch the head holes. And then my wife would hold up the shirts afterwards and kind of be like, I bought this. What, what's going on?
What did you do to
I'd
it?
say, oh, I don't know. And, and so this went on for a couple of months, and I chalked it up to inexperience. I chalked it up to, just kind of my nerves as a dad. I mean, I'm a fairly intense person as it is. So I just thought this is me being cautious. But within a couple of months, having to process those things all day and the routines of taking care of kids and going to work and maintaining all that, I was emotionally and mentally exhausted. And that really ended up carrying over into tension around the house. Small problems felt like huge problems. I write in the book, stubbing my toe made me feel like the world was coming to an end. Because I had these uncontrolled, intrusive thoughts about my kids, it made me a very, very, very overprotective parent, a very rigid thinker. I would get upset with family if I thought they weren't being careful enough. I would try and avoid certain situations where I thought they might be put at risk. And, on top of that, my wife, bless her, she's nursing, she's getting very little sleep, she's exhausted, she's in pain. And again, credit to her, she was really understanding. She just kind of came to me and said, what's going on? Like, just something's not right here. Something's got to change. And we made the decision for me to start therapy. And that was another big step, because when you go to therapy as a parent, there are these extra levels of emotions and fears that you have. One of the biggest ones was just, if I tell you about all these symptoms, are you going to get my kids taken away from me? Are you going to deem me an unfit father? Are you going to decide that I can't take care of my kids? I had a wonderful therapist who, that was also based on my misconceptions about OCD, but he was fantastic and relieved, all those fears. But there's also shame that comes along with it as a dad, but I think as a parent in general, you have this, I'm a protector, I'm a provider, I'm a parent, I need to be a rock here, and you're not at times. And you feel ashamed of that. You feel ashamed of not being what you wanted to be, what you thought you would be for your kids and for your family, and admitting that you need help at a time when you're really supposed to be just caring for everybody else. That was really difficult. And then there's also just the fear of how are all these things I'm going through going to affect my kids? I mean, everything you read about infants, they're little emotional barometers, they pick up on all your signs, your body temperature, your heart rate, everything. And here I am going like, oh my gosh, I can't keep this under control. I'm going to affect my kids. It's going to affect my kids. And of course, that just spins the cycle into a whole nother realm. Starting therapy was a big step and a difficult step. And I still remember, at the time, I knew as much about OCD as any member of the general public would. I had all the same misconceptions, thought of all the same stereotypical symptoms. In fact, like, I knew something was wrong, but I didn't suspect it was OCD because I thought, well, again, symmetry, contamination, all the typical ones. That wasn't a problem for me, or at least I didn't think it was. But I had a really good therapist who helped me explore a lot of that. We did a combination of a really good workbook that I used, individual sessions with him, and then a really good therapy group as well. And over the next 18 months, just went on a really intensive therapy journey together. And my wife and I had regular conversations, and we spent lots of time working out how this was going to work as a family, how I was going to, still be the parent that I wanted to be for my boys and have time and energy for this therapy, what was going to have to continue, what was going to have to stop. And over time, I'm very happy to say things improved. It's something that I would say took a lot of time, a lot of writing, a lot of introspection. But, fast forward to today, and I mean, we're very, very lucky. Our boys are happy and healthy and running and talking all day, every day. And this is something that I now feel comfortable talking to others about, and hence the book that I wrote. And, we've come to a good place, but, certainly when I look back, those were tough times.
Jason, thank you for being so vulnerable. And I didn't mind I'm not trying to remember what, the sharpness that you came, some things that you thought would upset people. No, I think it's important for people to hear it and to understand it. So, thank you for that. I was curious, as far as you said, excuse me, therapy.
Mm.
But was that basic ERP or what? Tell me a little bit more about what tools you used for your recovery.
Absolutely. So we started off with a really good workbook called, a 10-step workbook by Dr. Jonathan Abramowitz. That's primarily cognitive behavioral therapies, CBT exercises, and ERP. Yeah, so
Okay.
those were the two main modes. And it's interesting you mentioned that, especially as a parent with OCD, because when I first read about exposure therapy, for example, when I first read about ERP, I remember thinking, well, this isn't going to work. How am I going to do this how am I going to do this as a parent? I mean, the time, fine. Like, we'll call a grandparent over for an hour and I can take some time to do exposure. But one of my biggest fears, for example, was contamination at diaper changes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, well, I'm not going to gradually expose my boys to, harsher and harsher levels of bacteria just to prove that my fears are unfounded. Like what's going on here? I mean, and again, I realize how that probably sounds to some listeners, but that's where I was at that point. That's what I was genuinely thinking. So I ended up, and again, thankfully, I ended up doing a lot of imaginal exposures. Okay. That was a huge one. Another example that it was really useful for was heights. I really struggled even letting my boys crawl on climbers at the park, big rocks. We have a couple of family members that live in condos with balconies. Going out onto those balconies was just a huge trigger, nonstop intrusive thoughts. And again, it wasn't, I wasn't going to make my sons go up to riskier and riskier heights physically, just for me. So imaginal exposures were very, very helpful that way. A couple of CBT exercises that I found especially helpful. One was called the double standard list. And again, I think this one really relates to parenting, because I think for a lot of parents, I know certainly for me, you have certain trigger points with something like contamination. So for me, it was diaper changes. Mm-hmm. Well, what the double standard list does is you say, you write out, okay, what's the obsession? What's the fear? Well, the fear is that my kids are going to die from a life-threatening disease because I didn't clean their hands up enough after a diaper change. Okay. So you then take a look at other areas of your life and you say, when has contamination or bacteria been a hazard, but not actually posed a risk or not actually been a problem? And then I thought, it makes you kind of think, well, when you drop that piece of bread on the floor and then ate it again, that's a time when nothing happened. And, when he tripped on the street and kind of splashed his hands in a puddle and then stood up and we just kind of dusted him off and carried on, that was another time. And, so those are the types of things that my therapist and I worked through quite a bit. And then the last thing that we worked on a lot, and this was CBT based, was really just understanding the nature of intrusive thoughts and understanding the nature of obsessions and why compulsions come about, but also why they don't work. We developed a few different phrases of, what do I remember about how I think? What do we know about the presence of intrusive thoughts in the general public? And then even just being able to lean into them a little bit and sit with them, all those things. Those are the things that really made a big difference. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thank you for that. And now I'm going to ask you the odd question, and just to get your thoughts on it. But through this journey and where you are now, can you look back and see any good things that might have come from having OCD?
Yeah, it's funny. I've thought about this question before, and my answer to it has kind of evolved. And I always say, if you were to ask me a few years ago in the middle of my symptoms, I would probably give you a strange look and
or hit me,
and not you. I would hit the leave button and be gone. No,
that's true. That's true.
But what in that situation, you're kind of it's hard to kind of look at this and say, well, what good is this pain doing me? What's the upside to this pain? What's the upside to this fear? What's the upside to this exhaustion? What I absolutely would say now is there are two things that have come from this whole process, this whole journey. One is that I just have a much deeper sense of empathy and understanding for other folks who are at any stage of that journey, folks who are at the beginning of it and feel like they're stuck. Certainly for parents who are struggling and going through tough times with their mental health and not knowing where to turn or feeling ashamed, and again, not that I was not an empathetic person before. I mean, I work with kids and I I do a lot of work on just social thinking and empathy and just kind of, we almost call it emotional literacy in a way, right? Just being kind of emotionally aware. It's not as if I wasn't aware of those things, but having been through it firsthand, that's been a very good thing. Just that change in perspective of understanding, that it happens to kind of anyone and everyone, and why people may or may not start at certain points, even if they know they're suffering, and how you can also just be suffering and not necessarily know why.
Yeah.
Because that was me for a long time. And that's part of the backstory, which I'll, get into at another time. But the other thing I would say that's really good that has come out of it is that I can talk about this now. Like I feel so comfortable just being open and vulnerable about it. And again, I think not just because I'm a dad, but definitely because I'm a dad, I think it is harder still for dads. And again, I'm not stereotyping. I don't think it, and certainly I know that mothers have a lot of struggles too. And I'm certainly not belittling or, trying to kind of take the side of any gender, but I do think, in some cases there can be dads where they feel that, again, because of, if they feel like they have a protector, more authoritative role, it's harder to be vulnerable about these things. And that's something that I've gotten over and that I'm very open about now. And that's a very good thing that's come out of this, and I always tell people in terms of being able to talk about it, if people are wondering, does something like OCD or any other mental illness kind of only happen to a certain kind of person? I mean, again, that's another thing that I can just talk so openly about. It's like, no, it does not matter. I mean, and the research on OCD proves that, socioeconomic status, race, gender, religion, it does not matter. It affects everybody. It can affect everybody, I should say. So, but I can talk about all those things now, and I can open up about my own experience, and that makes the discussions that much more meaningful. So between, the extra empathy and the ability to just open up to others about it, that's something that has certainly added a silver lining to the whole process. Yeah.
And as a dad, not that I don't have OCD, but I can understand the point of, even as a dad, I think we have a harder time understanding it. My wife was more compassionate to it, was more understanding, and it took me a lot longer to, I always called myself kind of military at it, initially, what, are you kidding me? I'm cleaning this room at 11 o'clock at night. Are you kidding? Kind of thing. And it took me a while to get past that, because it didn't work, so I agree with you. I think that mothers tend to have a better connection with the child anyway, a better bond. So that was a really good point. I think you're right there. My last big question for you on this is, what advice would you give, especially here, since you're a dad with OCD, what advice would you give to another dad that's going through this same thing?
Mm-hmm. So that's an excellent question. And I think that, in part, I want to just preface this by saying that, I have a few thoughts, and I'm also very aware, even thinking back on my own process, that, bits of this may or may not resonate depending on where you are in your own process. Right.
Yeah.
But I think that, through my process, there's a few things that have really stuck out that I would like everybody to know. And it's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. The first thing, honestly, is to demystify the therapy process. That's one of my biggest pieces of advice for anybody. And when I say demystify, what I mean is, I know for me, therapy was one of those things that if you've never been through it, you sometimes have like a romantic, fantastical view of it. Maybe you've seen some kind of Freudian psychological thriller where someone's, delving deep into hypnosis and all these kind of, crazy mental labyrinths where they get to explain. And, or maybe, again, you've seen some comical stereotype of just somebody laying on a couch crying while there's a guy taking notes, this kind of thing. And, one thing I really want people to know is that it's a practical process. It's a practical process that I compare to a lot of other things. A lot of people, I think, don't know that therapy in a lot of ways is like, going out and seeking help with anything else. There are, belief systems and methodologies and there's a range of belief systems and methodologies, and you find the one that resonates with you and that works with you. and you work with a professional to create a process. It's I don't want to say it's as simple as that, because it can be an emotionally charged process and complex for some people, certainly. But I want people to know, again, demystify it, do the research, talk to a professional, and understand that it's a process. It's a process of uncovering a problem, setting a goal, and taking some concrete steps. Certainly for dads, but for parents in general, one of the things that I would really, really encourage is take a good objective look at the logistics of starting therapy. If you're at all worried that you can't do it because of time, money, whatever it is, my big piece of advice there is take a good hard look at how much time and money you have available. Don't let it sit at the level of concern. Take it to the level of analysis. So, take a week, take a little chart in a notebook and say, like, how much time am I spending on each of these things? And then ask yourself, and then take that to somebody and say, do you think I can, do you think I can create a reasonable program in the amount of time I have? I would really encourage, I certainly know that, parents who are in the newborn phase are not going to have time and energy for much other than keeping their babies alive. And I totally get that. I was in that phase too. And I'm not trying to preach the impractical or anything like that. But, once you get to those stages where there's a little more time and energy, take it to the objective place, write it out, look at the stats of your time and money, because if you just stay in the level of, I don't have time for this, you might be missing something. And then the last thing for me is when it comes to, your vision of what getting better would look like, avoid black and white thinking at all costs. My therapist always reinforced that we are working on a harm reduction model, not sort of a light switch. I had OCD, now I don't have OCD. I was clinical in my symptoms, now I'm not. Bam, bam. It's not that. It's a gradual harm reduction model. It's too simple to say that it's like getting in shape. It's a little too simple to say that, but that concept of a gradual progression that you have to maintain, but also that does change over time with consistent effort, that's a very, very apt analogy. So, if you're hesitant or you're feeling like you're in need of help or everything just seems insurmountable, focus on that concept of harm reduction, because the other thing that's going to do is help you define how your symptoms are causing you harm. And that's going to help you put them in order in terms of which ones you can tackle first. You asked me advice in the singular and I gave 3. Those are ones I really believe, and I hope those are okay.
Trust me. My wife says I say things in thousands of words that only really need about 5 words,
Oh, gosh,
so yeah.
You're talking to a guy who just finished a book, so I get it.
Yeah. And a couple of things I would add, because I think what you gave is great with the therapist too, is get one that fits you. You don't have to go with the first one you meet.
No.
So get one that feels good and all that for each person, because that we've been through that. We have found therapists for my kids and didn't fit, and it's like, no, let's find one that feels right, that works right, because to me that's important.
Absolutely. Well, and that's part of the demystifying thing. Again, I make a comparison to just think of all the teachers, coaches, bosses, leaders, whatever you've had in your life, any other professional, whether it's a physio or a general practitioner or whatever. The expression I use is, you'll meet lots, you'll connect with several, and you'll really thrive probably with a select few. And it's okay to it's okay to look in multiple places and wait until you find a connection, because the energy of having to go back and repair any damage done by a poor connection with a therapist is not good.
Yeah. And when the other thing about you mentioned about time, and I think that's wonderful too. One thing I might want to think about there is, how much time are you spending on the OCD? That over time, that's going to rebalance itself. In other words, you're probably, you could be spending hours on OCD, and taking hours with a therapist right now, it'll change that. And so it'll kind of, I don't know if that makes sense or not, but in other words, if you're spending 4 or 5 hours a day with compulsions, it's worth taking the time with the therapist to bring that down, and it'll start giving you time there to make up
Yeah.
for it, you know.
Oh, absolutely.
So,
Like if you think of your time as kind of a pie chart, right?
yeah.
The pieces of the pie start to shift. For me, one of the things that my wife and I talked about was kind of gradual goals for how I would spend time with my boys. One of the big things being, being comfortable to have the both of them on my own for an extended period of time, even just a half day or a day to give her some time away, either for errands or just peace and quiet. And that's one of the kind of direct correlations that I can see, is that the time spent in therapy, it's now something where I'm very happy. Like I could have my boys for a week straight if I needed to. And what I try and do on a regular basis is to say to my wife, even just for a half day at the end of a busy week, just go, like, get a coffee, run your errands, go get a massage, whatever. Anything is totally fine, but just I've got them. And again, I think that's something that, probably sounds like, well, yeah, I mean, that is a good thing that, a dad can do sometimes. But it's important that listeners know that there was a time in my life where that just wasn't.
Yeah.
It's not that it wouldn't have been safe. My boys would have been safe and fine, but it was not something that we saw as, as a comfort level. And it was something where we thought, well, this is something we need to work through together until this is a happy experience for everybody. And again, just to be very vulnerable about that. And we came up to that change fairly early on, kind of around the kind of 1 year to 18-month mark with our boys, because that was a big priority to be able to share that workload. But that concept of investing the time and energy now to get it back later, I mean, absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Well, Jason, it has been wonderful to talk to you, and hopefully you and I can do another segment where we talk about your book and we really kind of dig into the whole dad thing, so thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for being vulnerable. That, I think that vulnerability will inspire, and I appreciate that so much and so I thank you for that.
Well, no, thank you so much. I'm so happy to get the conversation out there. And, it was one of those things where when I was thinking about the book, one of the thoughts that kept going through my head was, there's no way I'm the only one in this situation. Yeah. But that was matched with, being very confused as to why there didn't seem to be a lot of talk out there about it. So I'm just very grateful for the chance to get to talk about it. And I hope the conversations continue.
So that is our story for this podcast. Remember, we want your story told here. If you want to tell us your success story, or just want to tell us where you're at, simply go to www.invisiblewheelchair.com, then click on the Tell Us Your Story on the top left side, or just click the Contact Don button on the right side towards the bottom. We want to give you a voice to your story. Until next time, keep working on your story for a happily ever after ending.